Hi everybody and welcome to the 40th episode of Mark Overanalyses film. Today I will be overanalyzing 2007's monumental There Will Be Blood. Before I begin, allow me to remind you that I am available for reading, script editing and story coaching at markoveranalysesstory.com. And also, if you enjoyed this podcast, please do share and or recommend it. It really would be a great help. There Will Be Blood was written and directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, based on the novel Oil, written by Upton Sinclair. Now, there are lots of reasons to study There Will Be Blood, but I was especially interested in how it splits opinion and why that might be, because many people not only consider it to be great, but maybe to be the greatest film of the century so far. But I've also often heard the question, is it a great film, or does it just have a great performance? Now, quite apart from the fact that as a writer, the phrasing of that question kind of triggers me a bit, I do understand where the question is coming from. And as is almost always the case, Roger Ebert, I think, puts it best. In his review, Ebert wrote, "There Will Be Blood is the kind of film that is easily called great. I am not sure of its greatness. It was filmed in the same area of Texas used by No Country for Old Men, and that is a great film and a perfect one. But There Will Be Blood is not perfect, and in its imperfections, its unbending characters, its lack of women or any reflection of ordinary society, its ending, its relentlessness, we may see its reach exceeding its grasp, which is not a dishonorable thing." Let me say this up top. This podcast is a week late, partially because of other commitments, but also partially because this film has been a pain to analyze. And in my heart of hearts, I wanted to end up on the first side of that argument. I wanted to discover some underlying structure that made this film make total sense and reveal some kind of glorious majesty. But in reality, the opposite kind of happened. The more I analysed There Will Be Blood, the more I agreed with Roger Ebert about it, which, to be fair, is the best possible company to keep. So, before I get into the structural breakdown, let me just say I'm especially interested in Ebert's points here that the characters are unbending, the narrative relentless, and the ending is, at the very least, imperfect. As far as I'm concerned, these three are very tightly interconnected. And really my biggest beef or focus is that the more I think about it, the less the ending works. And because the ending doesn't really work, the whole thing is a bit flat, actually. Ebert describes it as relentless, but I think that kind of comes from a lack of dynamic interplay between thematic arguments. I'm aware that I'm coming for a film that many consider a masterpiece, so I will try to justify everything I say here. And if I've missed anything, feel free to get in touch because I want to believe. Keeping all of that in mind as I go, first I'll look at the fundamental features of our iconic protagonist Daniel Plainview, then I'll go through the main story beats by looking at the sequences and stages of the film, and finally, with my straw reaching all the way across the room, I'll talk about the main things I learned from this exercise. So, let's begin by defining our protagonist, Daniel Plainview. He is, in his own words, an oil man at the turn of the century in California, and his story is going to serve as a kind of parable for the rise of 20th century American capitalism. Now, other than these surface factors, there are really three ways that our story defines just who the protagonist really is. That's their life dream, their want or tangible objective for the middle of the film, and their need. So Daniel's life dream is basically what he wants when we first meet him and before the events of the story really get going. Now the opening scenes are famous for how sparse yet evocative they are, and they really tell us one thing. Daniel wants to be rich, and he will do anything to get rich. So the next thing is the protagonist's capital W want, or the tangible objective for the middle of our film. This gives the protagonist a goal to strive for, and therefore something to keep them busy while they're growing as a character. It has to be both significant enough to last through the whole middle of the film, and tangible enough so that we can say whether or not it has been achieved. And this gives our story its sense of a beginning, a middle, and an end, or before, during, and after. And for a film this naughty, I am grateful to say that this is very straightforward, because Daniel Plainview explains it word for word to HW at the transition into Act 2. He tells him if there's anything here in Little Boston, they're going to build a pipeline to the coast, make a deal with Union Oil, and circumvent Standard Oil and their extortionate shipping costs. The last and arguably most important thing we need to define for the protagonist is his need. Now, normally, the need is the human quality or piece of wisdom that the protagonist lacks at the beginning of our story, but learns by its end. This isn't, necessarily a good thing or a bad thing as such. It's just a lesson that the protagonist learns, or a thematic argument that they embrace. And this is unfortunately complicated by the fact that, as far as I'm concerned, the ending doesn't really work, because the whole point is that the protagonist should come to express this thematic argument through action at the end of our story. So, for example, in Casablanca, Rick goes from a man who says he sticks his neck out for no one, to a man who gives up a life with the woman he loves so that they can both fight the Nazis. One more point on this quickly. I said this is normally the human quality that the protagonist learns, because there is another kind of story, like Wall-E, where you have what's called a guardian angel protagonist. In those kind of stories, the hero already has this piece of human wisdom, or the thematic argument of the film present within them, but the rest of the world lacks it. Now, I raise this just in case I've missed something, but as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing in Daniel Plainview that isn't plenty present in Eli Sunday and much of the rest of the world. So I'm assuming that There Will Be Blood is this first kind of story, where the tension of the film comes from whether or not Daniel Plainview himself will change. And to my mind, if there is an inherent thematic tension within Daniel Plainview, it is based on this question, or some question like it. Can the one truly loving relationship in Daniel's life save him from embracing his flaw of believing that life and happiness is a zero-sum game? Or will his obsession and his competition with adversaries overcome him? Basically, can his son save him, or will his hatred of others and his need to dominate them cause him to lose his soul? One final note on this: There Will Be Blood is not a story about someone learning the piece of wisdom to overcome their flaw. It's a downfall story about someone embracing a flaw. So, just for ease, where I would normally say need in the story analysis, I'll be using the term flaw here instead. Okay, now that I've set everything up and defined our protagonist and our thematic tension, let's finally have a look at the story stages of There Will Be Blood. There are traditionally, but not always, 8 sequences or stages in a film. A sequence is a combination of scenes that are tied together by having a single overriding dramatic question or tension, and they tend to be between 10 and 15 minutes in length. A good way to think about it is that every 10 to 15 minutes, the audience should be on some level asking themselves a different dramatic question deep down. Now, there's actually more like 10 sequences in There Will Be Blood, but they still fit into these 8 traditional story stages, as we'll see. But also, these 10 sequences actually fit really well into a Shakespearean-esque 5-act structure. So I'm going to be using this as a framework as I go. Basically, it's just the same as a 3-act structure, We've got a beginning, a middle, and an end, but we split that long middle into 3 separate acts. Looking at it this way, there are 2 sequences per act. Each act is about 30 minutes long. They all feel quite different, as we'll see, and every 30 minutes or so, there's a huge event that changes the direction of our story. So as I go along, I'll be using these points as kind of yardsticks, and I'll use them later to highlight some pretty cool elements of the structure, I think. So, Act 1 has our first 2 sequences, and the first one is always pretty much life as it is. And so we immediately join Daniel Plainview in a hole in the ground, hacking. Like any good film, There Will Be Blood introduces its protagonist by giving him a problem to solve and defining him by showing how he solves it. And so Daniel is relentless in his pursuit of wealth. He hacks at rock until he finds a sliver of silver, then falls and breaks his leg, and somehow drags himself and his broken leg along a desert floor to a town miles away. This is a man to be reckoned with. We cut to some years later, and our inciting incident, or the event without which our story, as it is, would not happen. Daniel is now digging for oil with a small crew, and a lethal accident kills a crew member, orphaning a poor baby boy. And again, we cut, this time to 7 years later, and we see that Daniel is now using his, quote, son and partner, HW, as a way to make him, well, appear less like a shark, basically, in his bid to buy land. Now, there's some important foreshadowing here that is probably really obvious to everyone else, but I somehow missed it for ages. When we first joined Daniel Plainview in 1909, he's pitching to a room full of people to let him drill for oil. But when the room erupts into argument, he walks out. Rather than give up on the oil though, he just moves further north and convinces a family to let him get to the oil from their property, which is exactly what he's gonna do throughout the rest of the film with the Bandy Tract. So yeah, pretty obvious. Don't know how I never noticed it, but I never put the 2 scenes together. Anyways, Daniel Plainview is now a successful oil man, and so an unknown young man approaches him, and we're left to wonder, can Daniel Plainview trust Paul Sunday? And this is interesting, because for all the world, this feels like a second inciting incident. Now, normally I wouldn't really pay too much attention to something like that, but I think here it's kind of telling, because as we'll see, we do almost have 2 separate stories taking turns throughout this film. We've got Daniel and HW on one hand, and Daniel and Eli Sunday on the other. Anyways, Daniel and HW soon hit for Little Boston, lie to the Sunday family about hunting for quail, and discover oil. So our sequence tension has been answered, and we're about ready to end our first act. So here is where we have our what's the plan scene. This is a scene at the transition between the first and the second act that tells the audience what they can expect to come. And so, at minute 31, Daniel sits down, looks at the vista, and explains to his son that they're going to buy the land, build a pipeline, and make a deal with Union. Daniel now has his want, or tangible objective, and so at minute 32, we end Act 1, and we enter Act 2. Act 2 is all about getting to the oil and developing the open rivalry with Eli. But also, in a 5-act structure, Act 2 is defined by what we can term the refusal of the call before it then ends with the acceptance of the call, or the protagonist's first unconscious move towards their flaw. So basically that means, in this act, the protagonist will initially try to fight where they are headed, or where the story is headed, before they eventually take a big step towards it at the end of the act. This is of special interest here because this sequence often really clarifies a character's arc. So again, in Casablanca, for example, Rick begins this sequence by being cool, calm, and dead inside, while saying he sticks his neck out for nobody. but at the end of the sequence, he is clearly bothered and upset as he buys drinks for Ilsa, her hero husband Victor, and the table. The direction of travel is crystal clear. Here, it's a little more complicated. So, Act 2 begins with Sequence 3, the first attempts to solve the problem. Our first tension here is, can Daniel buy all the land that he needs in Little Boston? And this is where we see Daniel buy the Sunday Ranch and where he first starts to come up against Eli Sunday as a real adversary.
Do you think there's oil here?
I know there is.
Oh, it's very expensive to drill. To get it up and out of the ground. You ever tried that before?
How much is it?
Costly.
Well, our oil sits right up on top of the ground.
I believe that's called seepage. Doesn't necessarily mean there's anything underneath.
What would you give us for it?
I don't know.
Something you don't know.
That's right. What would you like, Eli?
$10,000.
With this initial success, Daniel begins aggressively buying up local land. But of course, there's one holdout, Bandy. The old homesteader wants to meet the buyer directly, and Daniel, to his future detriment, dismisses this. Now, you could argue that all of this is a refusal of the call, right? Daniel has to play nice at this point, at least to a certain degree, but it does feel a bit external or shallow. Is he playing nice because he believes at this point in fairness? Or is he playing nice because he's not rich and powerful enough yet to run roughshod over these people, especially Eli? It won't surprise you that I think it's the latter. Anyways, I'll come back to this in a moment. The story starts to complicate as Eli visits the well, preaches to the workers, and insists that Daniel allow him to bless the derrick before it starts. And Daniel appears to agree, but this is Eli trying to compete with or even dominate him, and that will not stand. As a result, at minute 48, rather than introduce Eli as a son of these hills, he names the derrick after Eli's little sister Mary, a daughter of these hills. It is a sublimely petulant fuck you, and our first real glimpse of where this is all going. So, you might say, well, this could easily be the acceptance of the call, or the protagonist's first unconscious move towards his flaw, right? It certainly feels like that for the Daniel-Eli plot. It's the first really big movement in that story. But again, I mean, Daniel would have always done this, wouldn't he? So it doesn't feel really like a big character shift or movement. It doesn't feel like there's any real internal arc here. Anyways, Daniel now has his land, his active derrick, and his burgeoning rivalry with Eli is beginning to really take shape. We now wonder our new tension, can Daniel find oil here? And so at minute 49, we enter sequence 4, the greater attempts to solve the problem. And things do start getting harder. That night, a man dies in the hole. So, against his better judgment, Daniel is now forced to go and request the help of Eli in addressing the spiritual needs of the bereavement process. And fortunately for us, he arrives in time to see Eli acting like a fucking lunatic and a shyster at the same time in his small church. Once outside, Daniel's mask really begins to slip and the two sort of openly bicker. Things are really gathering steam now, so just as Eli's church is growing, Daniel's derrick blows. Unfortunately, when it does so, HW is lying above it. The blast deafens him, and while Daniel rushes to manage the explosion of oil, we wonder some version of the question, can Daniel find some kind of solution to HW's needs? Things are never going to be the same again, so at minute 59, we not only enter sequence 5, but we also end Act 2 and we enter Act 3. But, before I go on, I'd like to note something else about the refusal and the acceptance of the call. In Act 2, Daniel is relatively engaged and tight with HW, and that's not superficial. HW tells him that Mary is beaten by her father when she doesn't pray, and Daniel soon makes a point of telling Mary this isn't to happen anymore in front of her father Abel. So you could consider this a kind of refusal of the call, right? Or an attempt by Daniel to resist his flaw. But all that ends with the end of our second act and Daniel's acceptance of the call, or his first unconscious move towards his flaw. So, the striking of oil deafens HW, and given the choice to stay with his panic-stricken son or manage his oil concerns, Daniel chooses the oil.
Get in my voice.
You wait here for me. Understand? You wait here for me. I'll be back. I'll be back in a minute. You wait here.
Help me.
I'm gonna take care of you. Wait. Stay here. Stay here, son. I'm gonna fix this.
Help me.
It's gonna be fine. You wait for me here. Hold it down. Hold it down.
Help me.
This feels way more like a significant change and like a first unconscious move, because it feels like it's the first death knell for his relationship with his son. And also, like so many first unconscious moves, it's quick, it's in reaction to something else, and it's a choice that reveals something deep within the character, perhaps both to us and to the character themselves. This is totally the main plot. This is what the climax should be about. But anyways, it's a little early for the ranting, so let's move on. Okay, so now we're in Act 3. And this one is all about basking in the discovery of the oil. But this act is also the middle of our story and is split in two by the story's midpoint. So we can really see the protagonist experimenting with their flaw here, either side of a kind of thematic breakthrough. Finally, this act almost always closely foreshadows our climax. And we can certainly see this last aspect here in There Will Be Blood. When HW is deafened, Daniel makes sure he's alive, then rushes off to take care of the oil. Just like in our final act, Daniel chooses oil over his son. And once he has done as much as he can, Daniel stays squatting and watching the burning oil like a fucking maniac when he could and should return to HW. Grading this narcissist on a pretty generous curve though, he does, in his own fashion, really try to look after HW once the derrick is taken care of. Eventually though, when HW's hearing appears not to be coming back, Daniel asks his associate Fletcher to inquire about getting his son a teacher. Now, there's another scene in the screenplay here which didn't make the film, but I kinda wish it did. In the script, a teacher comes to Little Boston and Daniel offers her a lot of money to set up her own school here rather than take HW back to San Francisco with her. He even offers to move all the children and their families in her current school. But when she refuses, Daniel becomes irate and won't even let her see HW. During this conversation, she tells Daniel, "Building a school here might be better for you, but it's not better for your boy." So I think it's inarguable that Daniel does love his son, at least in the way that he can, but he is also so incapable of giving any ground whatsoever to any other person that he won't even let this teacher see his son if she won't move here to teach him. So again, to my mind, this feels way more thematically interesting and on point than a lot of stuff that is in the film. But still, at this point, there's no need for Daniel to end up as a drunken, raving lunatic all on his own in a mansion taking potshots at furniture. So I guess at minute 73 into a 151-minute runtime, almost exactly halfway, that means it's time for There Will Be Blood's midpoint. Now, a midpoint generally does a few different things. Most importantly, to my mind, it is the protagonist's first conscious move towards their flaw. So it builds on the first unconscious move, but also, as the description suggests, it should be more determined or clear to the protagonist what they are doing. Second, the midpoint foreshadows our eventual climax. Third, it ups the stakes of our story. So, Eli comes to Daniel looking for money, and Daniel suggests he's a fake and beats the crap out of him as Eli tries to crawl away to safety.
When do we get our money, Daniel?
Aren't you a healer? And a vessel for the Holy Spirit? When are you coming over and make my son here again? Can't you do that?
Let me bless the world. This happened! Daniel, you shouldn't have done that. Oh, you owe the Church of the Third Revelation $5,000. One of the arrangements that we made.
And this is all gonna seem awfully familiar later on. So, yeah, Daniel is more openly competitive and aggressive with Eli because he's upset by an inability to communicate with his son. And he's just introduced violence into the story, foreshadowing our climactic action, and raising the stakes. So on the surface, this looks like a textbook midpoint, and in many ways, it is. But because the midpoint and the climax are so closely linked, and because I don't think the climax really works, I think this is where the story really starts to get a bit muddled. Again, if you look back to Act 2, there's a general build of antipathy between Daniel and Eli, and this is upping the ante on it a bit. But that's all, and it's pretty flat stuff. So far, the story of Daniel and his son, I think, is way more rich and dynamic. So basically, the way I feel is that the film is really about that, but it's lacking a clear focus. So instead of having a midpoint and a climax based around the more important story, I think, of Daniel and his son, the film's midpoint and climax is about the far less interesting, far less dynamic, far less complex, and far less thematically rich plot of two narcissistic maniacs fighting each other. And on the note of added plots, a new arrival now lands in town. And so, at minute 77, we have a new tension as we wonder, will Daniel accept that this man Henry is his brother? At that, we enter sequence 6, There Will Be Blood's honeymoon sequence. The honeymoon sequence is so called as the protagonist has made their first conscious move towards embracing their flaw, and they generally act in accordance with the lesson they are beginning to embrace for a time. So, following from our midpoint in this case, Daniel should be embracing this kind of zero-sum, take-it-all approach to life, right? I mean, this is kind of supposed to foreshadow the climax, basically. And well, as much as I like the story of Daniel's brother Henry and the events in and of themselves, it's just a bit messy, and it feels like an example of the biggest issue here, that this story just keeps getting distracted from itself. So, on the one hand, you could argue that Daniel is oddly accepting of the fact that this Henry guy is his brother. It might be the most generous thing he does all film. Or you might say that Daniel is so willing to accept this guy that it feels like he's just filling a need that HW's deafness has left him with. In addition, Henry gives Daniel the freedom to express something dark deep within himself, the real core of this character and this story.
You an angry man, Henry?
About what?
Are you envious? Do you get envious?
I don't think so, no.
I have a competition in me. I want no one else to succeed. I hate most people.
It is no coincidence that this famous, iconic speech is delivered here at the heart of our film in the honeymoon sequence. And once again, Daniel foreshadows what he's going to do. He wants to earn enough money to get away from everyone. But he says, having Henry here gives him a second breath of life. So it does appear that there is a thematic push-pull here, right? It's just not quite in the right place or something. Anyways, Daniel has firmly accepted that this man is his brother, for some reason. Unfortunately, it appears HW is less accepting, so he tries to light Henry on fire in the middle of the night. Now, lots of people suggest that this is because HW reads the journal and figures out that Henry is a fake. But in the script, it's actually clear that HW is illiterate. So maybe he's suspicious, but I think more likely he's probably jealous, confused, and angry. I mean, it's likely that nobody even told him who this guy is or why he's here, so he acts up by setting fire to his competitor. And to think Daniel Plainview says HW has none of him in him. Likely as a result of his attempted arson, we have arguably the hardest scene of the film to watch, and a real breaking point. Daniel Plainview lies to and abandons his boy. And again, I have to say, I think it's pretty clear here that Daniel Plainview might be a narcissist and a broken man, but he does love HW. He not only clearly feels shame for what he's doing, he feels real hurt. And again, it's so much richer than the other plot going on. So, Daniel has now lost the one person who really loves him. And it's pretty clear things aren't going well anymore. And so, at minute 90, it's time we left the honeymoon sequence and our Act 3 and enter Sequence 7, the first of two sequences in Act 4, our bridge from the honeymoon to the low point. The basking period is over, and now Daniel needs to get on with completing the plan. He's got an ocean of oil all to himself, but he has to get it out of Little Boston somehow. If he can do that, he'll have accomplished his tangible objective. So this, along with his collapsing personal life, is what our fourth act is all about. To begin our act, Daniel meets with Standard Oil, and it doesn't go great. He threatens to cut Tilford's throat for suggesting that he could look after his boy better if he had loads of money and free time, and Tilford, child-rearing advice aside, makes the point that for all his success, Daniel will have a job on his hands to build a pipeline and make a deal with Union. So there's a real tension here. But hey, at least the meeting didn't run over. This is when our unaddressed Sequence 3 problem hits. Daniel never met with old Bandy, and as a result, never got his tract. And now we wonder, can he buy Bandy's lot and build his pipeline? Daniel and Henry take off through Bandy's lot and go on to the Pacific. Making their deal with Union, the brothers go for a swim on the beach, and what follows is just an incredible scene with some incredible acting from Daniel Day-Lewis. Making a joke about getting liquored up and taking some women to the Peachtree dance, it's pretty clear that Henry doesn't pick up on something. And the way Daniel Day-Lewis is able to convey his slow realization, it's just mesmerizing. It's amazing. And it's worth noting, he looks really hurt, like he feels genuinely betrayed. And of course, that hurt soon turns to, murderous rage. But when the time comes to do the deed, it does feel thematically important that the fake Henry says that he would never want to hurt Daniel. He's just trying to survive. Henry is dead. Now, I might be reading too much into this, but I do think this is when Daniel really starts to come apart. His drinking takes on a kind of different quality than we've seen before. He's clearly always been a big drinker, but this is the drinking for oblivion kind of drinking that will look familiar in our final act. But from here, Bandy wakes him, having discovered his evil deed, and tells Daniel that he can build his pipeline if he gets baptized by Eli, which feels like a pretty light penance for murder all in all. And I do have to wonder if anyone ever brought up Henry ever again, or did everyone take one look at Daniel and say, "Hey, remember that guy who said he was the boss's brother? Because I sure don't." Eli is totally cool about the baptism thing, and it's a chill ceremony. Except that he smacks Daniel around the place, reminds everyone that he owes the church $5,000, and makes Daniel repeatedly declare that he has abandoned his child. But there's an interesting note at the end of this scene clarified in the screenplay. The script says, "There is warmth from everyone here that Daniel begins to feel. They touch the back of his head and his shoulders and give him love. Eli notices this. Eli then tells the others to let him take in the spirit on his own." So even at the moment of his zenith, there's still this sense that Eli is losing. Now, that's kind of interesting, but I think it's also further evidence of an issue. Eli just isn't enough of an antagonist. He's just not strong enough as an antagonist. Regardless, Daniel has his pipeline. So we have just enough time for one last sequence 8 now, before we end our long middle of the film. At minute 116, HW returns, and we wonder if Daniel can truly make amends with his child. But it doesn't start out well, because HW is understandably angry, and it doesn't continue so well either over a meal. Now, this scene with the meal here is not as iconic as the climax of the film, but it's pretty famous, and rightly so. It comes right near the end of the second act, and it feels like the film in a nutshell. At least, the best parts of the film, I think. At one table, Daniel Plainview has his son beside him, and at the next table over, he has a competitor, Tilford. And Daniel cannot stay at his table. He can't help but be distracted from his son, who he has only just been reunited with, because he has to put it up to Tilford and the Standard Oil delegation. Now, there's a lot going on here. For one thing, Daniel makes a show of being tender with his boy, but we end the scene with HW clearly looking uncomfortable and like he'd rather be anywhere else. For another, Daniel makes great play of the fact that he told Tilford what he was going to do, and he did it. And he wants Tilford to be crushed and decimated, to look like a fool. But Tilford doesn't. Daniel does. He looks like a drunken, unhinged, petty, petulant, small mess of a man.
I'm very happy for you that...
Yes, I made a deal with Union. My son is happy. He's safe.
Congratulations.
I'm taking care of him now, so...
Excellent.
You look like a fool, don't you, Tilford?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, you do.
Excuse me, gentlemen.
Oh, excuse me, gentlemen.
It's a brilliant scene. Additionally, we soon see that Eli is leaving on a mission, perhaps with the money that Daniel was finally forced to cough up. So, Daniel has won, right? He has his company, he's rich, he's brought his son home, one nemesis has been outdone, and the other is leaving. But Daniel's success seems to have left him feeling as unsatisfied as ever. He did all of this, and yet Tilford, Standard Oil, and Eli Sunday still feel undiminished, and his son still feels somewhat removed from him. And so, this is our thematic low point, where generally the protagonist no longer believes the counter-argument, but the argument feels impossible. And while the story itself has this feeling, it still seems to me like it's not fully invested in its protagonist. Daniel probably should realize that striving for total domination over your fellow man is not the answer, but it seems like he just doesn't have the emotional capacity for that kind of thought. Anyways, after a brief montage of HW and Mary getting closer and closer, at minute 126, with 25 minutes left to go, we end Act 4 and we enter our final act, Act 5. Act 5 has a false resolution and a true resolution. Now, obviously I have a lot to say here, but There Will Be Blood is particularly interesting on this note because both these sequences are really dominated by one scene each, and you'll notice that the false resolution is spent with HW, while the true resolution is spent with Eli. So again, I think kind of externally or superficially, the story seems to have this thematic argument in place. In the false resolution, Daniel is dealing with the personification of his better nature, or his only hope. In the true resolution, he's dealing with fucking Eli. So, we skip forward to 1927, and our false resolution begins with a now grown-up HW marrying his childhood sweetheart Mary. Then we see what has become of his father, and Daniel Plainview is drunkenly shooting furniture down a long corridor in his mansion and then checking his shot with a magnifying glass. So, living his best life, I guess. His son soon arrives to meet him, and it's apparent that they have been drifting apart due to business practices. Once again, the script actually makes this clearer. Daniel has been voraciously buying new land while reneging on his existing contracts. In response to this, HW has tapped up Fletcher to come with him on his new endeavour. But Daniel was never one to understand the concept of friendly competition, so he immediately categorizes HW as an enemy and declares that he is not his son. So, HW walks out as Daniel shouts after him. For all this wealth and sway, Daniel seems to feel somewhat powerless and frustrated. So, you can see how this is a continuation and expression of the low point. A recollection of happier times comes before a sad, drunken stupor down some steps. Now, it probably won't surprise you to know, at this point, I think this is all great. I think with some tweaking, this could easily be the end of our film, and it would work really well. But of course, it's not the end of our film. And so at that, with 15 minutes left, we enter There Will Be Blood's true resolution. And there are a few more iconic true resolutions in the 21st century so far. Eli comes to ask Daniel for money in exchange for the bandy tract, and as the scene starts, it's the younger man who seems to have the advantage. But then, well, Daniel drinks his milkshake, bullies Eli into submission, and, declaring himself to be the third revelation, murders Eli with a bowling pin.
I drink your milkshake. I drink it up!
Don't bully me, Daniel!
Did you think your song and dance and your superstition would help you, Eli? I am the third revelation. I am who the Lord has chosen. Because I'm smarter than you. I'm older.
And at that, enigmatically, he's finished. Okay, so There Will Be Blood drove me a little insane trying to deconstruct it. So what I'd like to do here is talk about how cool some of the structuring is, and also what really drove me a little crazy with it. So, first, I'm a massive fan of the book Into the Woods by John York, and there are two aspects raised in that I find especially interesting here. One, the idea of fractal structure. Now, that basically means that every story has a beginning, middle, and end. But within that beginning, you also have a smaller beginning, smaller middle, and smaller end. And this can go on and on and on down to individual scenes, or beats even. Basically, the idea is that the part should reflect the whole and the other way around. What I find interesting looking at the 5-act structure of There Will Be Blood is that every one of these acts has its own mini midpoint, which foreshadows its own mini climax. So, in Act 1, Daniel adopts HW at minute 14 to use him to buy land to drill for oil. At minute 29, HW finds the oil on the Sunday Ranch and Daniel tells him the plan. In Act 2, at minute 49, Daniel screws over Eli and tells HW to turn on the derrick. At the end of the act, Daniel and Eli outright argue over whose work is more important right before the oil bursts forth, deafening HW. In Act 3, the film's midpoint is with Eli, but the third act's own mini-midpoint is arguably the moment Henry arrives. The climax is when HW is packed off, presumably because he attacked Henry for replacing him. Now, Act 4 is a bit wonky because Sequence 7 is a lot longer than Sequence 8. You could argue that at the end of Sequence 7, HW comes back, and then at the end of Sequence 8, he's moved beyond Daniel. Or you could argue that going by timing, Daniel kills Henry at the mini midpoint before confronting Standard Oil and vanquishing Eli at the climax. Finally, Act 5's midpoint sees Daniel piteously descend some stairs, blind drunk. This feels like both a literal and figurative descent that will end with him murdering Eli down there. 2. John York is a huge fan of the idea that the whole story is divided by the midpoint. Around this midpoint, the first half and the second half of the film are actually mirror images of each other. So at the beginning of Act 1, Daniel is underground hacking. At the midpoint, Daniel buries Eli in mud and oil. And at the end of Act 5, he is once again underground hacking. This time, though, he's hacking Eli. So there's a really clear connection, it feels like, between our opening, our midpoint, and our climax. At the end of Act 1, 30 minutes into our film, Daniel discovers oil and lays out his plan. At the start of Act 5, with 26 minutes left in our film, his plan has succeeded and all the oil is his. At the end of Act 2, 60 minutes in, the oil deafens HW. With 60 minutes left, HW is sent away. But there's more. This also works for the act's midpoints. So 15 minutes in, Daniel adopts HW. With 15 minutes left, he disowns him. 47 minutes into the film, Daniel refuses to let Eli bless the well. With 42 minutes left, Daniel agrees to be baptized by Eli. And the overall acts work this way as well. In Act 1, Daniel begins with little but a burning ambition and purpose, so this is before. In Act 2, he's trying to get to the oil in the ground. In Act 3, he has the oil, but he can't move it. In Act 4, he's trying to get the oil out of the ground. In Act 5, after, Daniel is rich, but he has no purpose. Now, that's the kind of thing I find pretty cool, because, I have a problem, I guess. So I can't sit here and tell you that the story structure of There Will Be Blood is, underdeveloped or something. There is a lot to admire here. But there is still this problem that nags at me more and more and more. And really, it's that it feels like there are two different plots here. They're lacking in sufficient thematic unity, and the ending is, if anything, for the wrong one. I find that There Will Be Blood is one of those films where you could ask someone, what's it about? And they might say, it's about capitalism versus religion, or the 20th century versus the 19th century, or it's about America, or something like that, right? And you can see why. Our climax shows a capitalist beating a priest to death with an object that is an expression of his wealth. But none of those ideas mentioned are universal human thematic arguments. In Casablanca, when Rick gives up a life with the woman he loves to go fight the Nazis, I understand what that choice means on a purely thematic or moral level. It's about accepting a call to heroism and selflessness. You can strip everything else away. It works on that purely thematic or moral level. Now, you could argue that capitalism versus religion has some kind of inherent values within it. That it's, about something like individualism versus a more collective idea. Well, okay, but which of these ideas does Eli fucking Sunday represent? Yeah, on a superficial level, this is a capitalist beating a priest, but really, the whole film has told us it's one selfish narcissist beating another, which is what makes the Daniel-Eli plot or arc feel so thematically flat. Or, to jumble some of Roger Ebert's phrasing, a relentless plot with unbending characters. But what if HW and Eli represent different arguments? What if HW is a call to be more loving and collaborative, and HW is the opposite, a force of nature looking only to dominate? Well, you might look at how the false resolution is spent with one, and the true resolution with the other, and go, well, there you have it, there's your thematic story shape. But it doesn't work, because Daniel is too flat and actually quite passive here. He doesn't choose to see either of these people. They both come to him, and he just doesn't change. In a funny way, this reminds me of Groundhog Day as an example of a complete opposite. When I was studying that film, I found that we could chart Phil's changes so clearly because everything else stays the same. So if something was different, it's because Phil was different. And because Phil was different, everything was different. And despite all the scenes being repeated again and again and again, you couldn't switch any of them around or it would be really confusing and make no sense because every scene was so in sync with Phil's character arc. In There Will Be Blood, I think Daniel probably changes, but not a lot, right? I mean, if you try to describe his change, it's generally in some kind of term like he loses his mind or he loses his soul. But what does that even say then? I'm not sure. And in the final act in particular, I think you could basically cut the final line and switch the false and true resolutions. I mean, it would be a bit weird that he murdered Eli and nothing happened, but he already murdered Henry and nothing happened. And this is because this is the opposite of Groundhog Day. Daniel is the same, but the external situation has changed. HW is in one scene and Eli is in another. He can't dominate HW because he's too decent, but he can dominate Eli because he's the opposite. But you could switch these two around because this is something external and therefore shallow and superficial. It's not invested in the protagonist. Deep down, this ending in particular highlights that Daniel's character arc is just too unbending and too relentless, at least for me and the kind of things that I look for in a film. There's just not the clarity and focus there to provide the depth required for this to be a quote-unquote perfect film. Now that is not to say that There Will Be Blood is a bad film. It's not. It's amazing in so many ways. But it might just be a flawed masterpiece. And that, to quote Roger Ebert, is not a dishonorable thing. This has been Mark Overanalyses Film on There Will Be Blood. If you enjoyed this episode, or like the podcast in general, please do recommend it to anyone you know who might like it too. It really would be a great help. A special thanks to Mary Kate O'Flanagan, who taught me everything I know about film, including these methods. Thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and see you soon.